Welcome, B-movie fans, to this week's episode of B-Movie Chat. One of the key ingredients to making a great horror film is blood. Who doesn't love a nice gore fest once in a while? It's the icing on the cake that adds the extra bit of terror that's sometimes needed. Sure, not in all horror films is there an excess amount of gore, but still, those ones manage to be scary too. Most of the best horror films, however, don't shy away from visceral horror. If balanced with a well-crafted story, adding a healthy dose of blood and gore can bring an extra element of dread and realism to a film that will make it memorable enough to haunt our nightmares. However, some films consist of nothing more than scene after scene of blood splatter and have little to no story to back it up. In fact, the plot does have serves to do little more than provide excuses for more torture and blood. The question we hope to answer tonight is, how much blood is too much? When does a film stop being a horror film and become little more than torture porn? Is torture porn just another type of horror? Joining us today for this chat is filmmaker Dan Young. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back on, guys.
All right, I guess we should have said welcome back to the show.
Yeah.
So, horror versus torture porn. This is one of those questions that keeps me up at night, so... Yeah.
It's an interesting one, yeah, I'll give you that. I mean, when you guys sort of came to me saying, you want me back on the show, which, thanks for that, we had sort of a few ideas as to what, we could talk about, and you mentioned that you wanted me to talk about this, and initially I was like, oh my god, what do I say about it? But then I've sort of been thinking about it over the last few days, and yeah, we can have a pretty decent conversation about this, I think.
For me, it's one of those movies that, like, any movie that's like a torture porn, like, the first time I watch it, I'm like, okay, this is all right. And then the second time I go to watch it, I'm like, all right, like, is there really a reason to be watching this again? And, like, one of the big franchises that comes to mind for me with it is Saw. Like,
yeah, and that's kind
Saw
of...
movies. Even the first one.
Yeah, it's kind of what started it all off. I mean, I think if you go sort of... I mean, really, torture porn is one of those terms that was kind of, I guess it was kind of coined by kind of mainstream media that's very kind of anti-horror and those kinds of people. When you sort of go back to the early 2000s, we had, it was the very start of a lot of horror films, like old horror films being remade. You had Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003. I think the following year was like the Dawn of the Dead remake. And so we were seeing this start of this new trend of like remakes, but coinciding with that,
and of course with these remakes, they added more blood.
Yeah, of
more
course,
than the originals
to try and top the originals. And I think part of it played in from that, and the fact that kind of we had this sort of new wave of extreme films. In the very early 2000s.
High Tension, I think, was one of the big ones.
Yeah, that was one of them. There's a slew of them. There's like a lot of those sort of, the French New Wave of extreme films, and I think that kind of played into it. But Saw was the one that really kicked things off, and Hostel, things like that. And I think that's around about the time. Yeah, I mean, that's around about the time the term was kind of, thought up, dreamed up, or whatever. But to be completely fair, I mean, in its defense, I guess, films like that have been around for a lot longer than the term itself. I mean, you go back to kind of the 70s and 80s, and you've got, say like Lucio Fulci's New York Ripper, for example. That's pretty, that would come under the sort of torture porn bracket if it was kind of released today. And films like that. I mean, there's a lot. Sort of the cannibal movies, for example, like Cannibal Holocaust, things like that.
One of the biggest offenders that I think of this genre is the Faces of Death series.
Yeah, exactly.
They claim to be the real death scenes, which I think like one or two of each film is actually like something that happened.
Yeah,
it's
like a little bit in
these death scene after death scene with no story at all. Like it's even worse than torture porn.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like I say, it's been around a hell of a lot longer than the term itself. But I think because we had that very short period between Saw. I mean, Saw came out and it did really well. It was very popular at the box office. And then Hostel, it just kind of felt like this was the new thing, or this was a new trend in horror. and the anti-horror kind of guys had to jump on board with something, and kind of it's kind of, I suppose it was launched as a derogatory term really for horror films, the sort of horror films that are coming out at the time.
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with, especially with movies like Saw and Hostel, where it seemed like, well, especially with Hostel, where it's kind of just, let's see how much we can get away with and how much we can shock people. And I don't think there's anything really inherently wrong with that as far as like just kind of showing things. But I think that people realize there's not a lot going on. It really doesn't take a lot of talent as far as writing goes with it. It's just kind of an excuse to show things. Like
and with Hostel, like if I'm remembering correctly, Hostel wasn't even that bloody of a movie.
No.
There were a few like scenes like the fucking hanging eye, but but it was mostly just when he went from room to room and saw like, okay, this person is doing this to people, this person is doing this to people, but it more left it up to your imagination to see like what is the result of that person doing that. Like when you open the door and you get that like 2 or 3 second glimpse of this room.
Yeah, I think like you were just mentioning, I think if you spoke to anybody that's seen that film, that's the one scene they're going to bring up as like the worst part of that film is the eyeball thing, and but everything else in there isn't exactly. I think you kind of remember it being worse in your head, but if you was to watch that film now, you'd probably be like, oh, actually pretty tame compared to some other movies that have come out since.
That's what I mean. Like, when you mentioned Hostel, I was really in my head. I'm like, is that really considered one of the torture porn films? Like,
that's like the default one people go to.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, like I said, Saw came out, and I think it was pretty much the year after it was Hostel, and because obviously, Saw did really well, and then subsequent sequels, it was just becoming I mean, there's other sort of smaller films coming out around the sidelines trying to cash in on it, I think, really, as well. But those are the main two, really, I think.
And one of the lesser-known ones, which I think we still need to finish, Paul, is Video Violence.
Oh, yeah, that's literally just these two guys own a video store, and, they film a bunch of smut films. The second one is just people, like, filming fake torture scenes and things like that.
It's like everybody in town is now in on it and filming, like, just them torturing people. It's like, hey, watch who I killed this week. Like...
Yeah, I've heard of that. I haven't actually had a chance to see anything of those, but
there's some other like lesser known, like the violent shit series. I think is one of them.
Yeah.
I think if you go down the video nasties list, you'll find a couple torture porns.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, that's also bringing it back to that. Actually, that's kind of a similar thing, really. Back in the 80s in this country, we had that whole video nasty thing, and that was just another term coined by like the mainstream media to kind of classify, horror films in a way, and anything could kind of fall under that. There was no real, I guess, the only thing I can say really for the term itself, torture porn, is it's fairly specific in its description of what you're gonna get. It's, I mean, let's be honest, we can watch kind of a action thriller kind of war film that has scenes of torture, but that's not considered torture porn because there's a story behind it. There is it's shot in a way that's a little more classy. There's it's in a mainstream film, and I think because these are horror films and the kind of reaction to what's happening, honestly, there's slight revel in it, in another person hurting another person quite badly or killing them, because it kind of, that's what people kind of want to see, and that's kind of the point of it, and there's nothing else really going on. I think that's why people kind of, there's a bit of a backlash to it, and that's why we don't consider torture scenes in other types of movies or other genres anything to worry about.
Well, and that's one of those things that that brings up something that I've wondered a lot. My wife loves to watch, like, she'll sit and watch war movies and stuff with me. She'll sit and watch Saving Private Ryan, Black Hawk Down, both extremely violent movies. But and she'll sit through the bloodshed and the explosions and the limbs coming off and everything with no problems. But then we watch, like, she cannot sit through, like, Friday the 13th, or like she had a really hard time watching Reanimator with me one time, which,
Yeah.
like, by comparison, like, even Reanimator, which is a very violent film, like, to Saving Private Ryan, it pales in comparison the amount of violence and blood that's in the movie. But
Yeah.
she, like, there are so many people, and I don't understand that. Like, you can watch this, which has all this violence and gore, but you can't watch this, and you say it's because of the violence and the gore.
So it's the subject matter, isn't it? I think, really, in a way. Yeah, and that's really what it mainly comes down to. It's not violence for violence sake so much. Whereas with the sort of torture porn genre, and I'm making a generalisation here, but with most of those movies, that's kind of the point. And with Saving Private Ryan, you know, it's not just about that, and I guess that's kind of the difference. But I get completely what you're saying.
Yeah, it's interesting to me.
I wonder if part of it has to do with the fact that, like, kind of like what you're saying, where it's the context of it and the story going along with it. But as far as like Saving Private Ryan takes place in a war, like you mentioned another one,
Black Hawk Down.
Black Hawk Down. I think people are able to kind of distance themselves because they were soldiers. So if like you're not a soldier or one that's actively in war, it's kind of like it's separate from you because it's like another world, or it's like somebody being hunted down by like a murderer or something like that, or somebody being tortured. That person's kind of supposed to be a substitute for the audience, like each audience member, like they can kind of imagine themselves in that. So I think it's more of a personal thing, maybe more than like a actual thing with a gore.
Yeah, I mean the characters of the soldiers, for example, in the war film, they're kind of, you know, I mean, presumably, depending on the film, etc., it's that they're not, you know, they don't want to kill, you know, whereas with the kind of the torture porn genre, it's generally that's the sort of main aim of the character doing the actual killing.
One thing I've noticed is a lot of especially low budget films definitely will lots of times go with more gore and more torture because it's something they know they can do well for a small budget. And I think lots of times because they're pressed for time, because they don't have a lot to work with, they'll focus more on the torture scenes and the blood and the visceral sort of elements because it's really all they can do. Plus, it's just kind of fun and everything. So I think in some ways a lot of like lower budget films kind of get thrown in that. And since they're not Hollywood films or big name films, it's a lot easier for people to kind of knock them for things. Whereas for like higher budget films, it's like, oh well, you know, it was art for some reason.
Well, that brings up another point. Do you think it might be this big conspiracy that Hollywood came up with this idea of torture porn to label these movies because like movies like Saw did so well? Don't go see that. That's torture porn. You need to see this movie because this movie is art. That's just torture porn.
Yeah, I feel like that plays into it quite heavily, to be honest. I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying.
I could definitely see that. I'm not sure so many a big plot, but I think it's like they were definitely judging certain movies worse. Like, it's not so much a torture porn, but the movie I Spit on Your Grave, that one got lambasted by people back when that came out because it was like, oh, it was nothing but like torture, and you know, it was using rape as a subject matter for to shock people. But it's like, you know, it does more than just that. It's like the murder scenes and everything. It's like there is more to it. And I've seen a lot of Hollywood movies that have really no substance to them at all. But I think for like movies like that and lower budget films, it's just like, yeah, they're definitely more biased because, well, who are the ones getting paid to give the big reviews and all that?
Yeah, no, definitely. No, I pretty much agree with that. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of an example here, but I know like there are some movies where I've seen and I'm like, this is a fantastic movie, but like it just got just killed in the reviews, and it's one of those movies like you know, there are a lot of movies that come out like sort of, oh god, I'm drawing a blank here.
You know who's in the film or like when it came out?
No, but it also makes me think of like now I may be getting my facts mixed up, but I think it was like 1961. Was that when West Side Story came out?
Sounds about right.
I believe this is the right example. I may have like forgotten which movie it is, but I'm pretty sure it's West Side Story. The year that West Side Story came out, it swept the Oscars. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know how many movies were like officially released because there was some kind of strike or something going on at the time. Do you know how many movies were actually eligible for the Oscars that year?
No idea, no.
12.
Okay.
So, and it's one of those things, they try to discredit other movies so that your bigger names or your bigger productions or whatever, get that recognition that they think that deserves. And I think that drives into play a lot of times with these lower budget or these independent films that try to compete with, or like films that are outside of the norm or the standard, or again, if they're striking from the Screen Actors Guild or whatever shit they want to do, they just in that way they find a way to say you shouldn't see this or this is terrible just for that reason.
That's why I don't watch the Oscars.
I'll admit I don't watch them either.
One thing I was thinking about was also a lot of films from before I mentioned I Spit in Her Grave, but I was thinking about the movie Freaks a while back because it's one of my favorite films, and that was considered so controversial that it ruined poor Todd Browning's career. But it seems like lots of things like films that are considered torture porn and just like controversial and exploitation, a lot of times it's because that stuff is not acceptable at the time, but I guess it doesn't really mean it's never going to be accepted. Like nowadays, if a movie like Freaks or something like that really wouldn't be considered that bad.
Well, I mean, they did remake it. It was called American Horror Story Season whatever by Ryan Murphy, where he used. I mean, that was the whole draw of Freaks. It was actually the actors were the quote unquote circus freaks, and Ryan Murphy did that in his circusy American Horror Story season, where he used people that actually had these diseases and defects and what have you.
And the only controversy was him being a shitty writer.
Yeah. I mean, well, no, people don't see that because he's mainstream. It's big. It's that, and that's the thing too. Like,
were good.
I know so many people. Oh, I love American Horror Story. I've seen American Horror Story. Oh, well, have you ever seen this movie? Oh no, that's too violent. Or oh no, that's too scary. It's the same fucking thing. This is just dumbed down for TV with shitty writing.
It's kind of the same thing with Walking Dead as well, though, because you get a lot of people like, oh man, I love Walking Dead, I love zombies, etc. But then you say, oh, have you seen this film? And it's like, no, nothing against The Walking Dead. I actually quite like the show. I'm one of the few. I think I'm in the minority here, but it's. I see what you're getting at. It's the TV version of it, and people are okay with that, but won't have seen anything remotely similar to it.
My mom's boyfriend is like that. Like if you put on Halloween around him, he will piss his pants. But like he watches The Walking Dead with her every Sunday. Another movie, what was it that just came out starring the guy that was Loki, about the cast, not the castle but the mansion.
Crimson Peak.
Yeah, Crimson Peak, that piece of shit.
Yeah.
He tried to watch that with her. He's like, no, I can't deal with this. It's just too much. I'm like,
scary at all.
What's too much? Incest? Is it the incest? It must be the incest. And funny thing, he lived in West Virginia for many years. Like,
You think he'd be accustomed to that?
Exactly.
That guy needs to watch some violent shit. Clearly, he needs that in his life.
Like, there's a lot of people that I've known that they don't watch horror things, but they watch The Walking Dead because it's that mainstream. It's right there, and it's saying, okay, this is normal to watch. It's okay. And the writing was good at the beginning. Like, I still enjoy watching the show, but I enjoy watching it to bitch about it more so than I enjoy watching it to actually see what's going on.
Okay, fair enough. It kind of brings into another sort of... this is another topic of conversation. I know we're going on a bit of a tangent here, but I have this sort of problem with... Because obviously, I love horror movies. That's my thing, right? But it's looked down upon. And there are a lot of films that are basically horror films, but they market them completely differently because, if we market it as a horror film, it won't do so well. Perfect example of which is like 28 Days Later. It's, so many people would consider that a thriller or, the pandemic thriller or whatever they want to call it.
An apocalyptic drama.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly, right? But it's a fucking horror film. Let's be honest. It's got zombies in it. Essentially, it's a horror film, and it rips off like so many other horror movies as well. You know, that's like this main influence is like a handful of like really awesome classic horror films.
Yeah, I mean,
what else it could be, you know?
And then here in the U.S., you have the opposite thing where films will be try to be marketed as a horror film, or people will label it as a horror film to get it to sell better, because it has become so mainstream over here. I was walking through a store today, and in the horror section, they had Snakes on a Plane. I've seen Snakes on a Plane. I love Snakes on a Plane. Snakes on a Plane in no way, shape, or form is a horror film, unless you have a phobia of snakes.
I guess that could be, yes, maybe, at a stretch. But yeah, I think, another example, I think, and this kind of, I guess, comes full circle a little bit, is around the time, or soon after the time, Saw and Hostel, you know, did decent money at the box office, and that kind of, the marketing strategy behind those was pretty aggressive. So other kind of movies felt the need to kind of do that. I remember very specifically, I don't know if you saw, I think it came out in like 2008-ish, a film called Untraceable, which I actually quite like. I think it's a pretty decent movie, but all of the kind of the advertising, the posters, everything for it, kind of, they made it feel a bit more like it was like a kind of a Saw film or a Hostel kind of a movie. And while it had like kind of gorier elements to it, it was essentially, it's pretty much a horror film, but there was a lot more drama in there, a lot more story, a lot more going on than the kind of advertising gave it credit for. So I don't know whether it actually helped or did it a disservice.
Well, that reminds me of I just saw Hellraiser for the first time last month, and everybody always talks about Hellraiser. It's a monster movie. It's got the fucking whatever those guys are called. I can't remember anymore. But
Cenobites.
Yeah, the Cenobites. So like we watched the movie, and like my initial like reaction was kind of disappointment, because it was not a monster movie. It wasn't even really so much a horror movie as it was a thriller. And, like, the more I think about the movie, the more I remember and, like, have time to dwell on it. Like, I love that movie now because, like, I've finally been able to accept this is not a monster movie. It's not even a horror movie. It's a thriller, but it's done so well. And they market it, and it's always locked in with horror, like, hardcore horror. And it really isn't. And that's one of those things that stands out about it.
I mean, it's more the visceral side that I guess.
When it's had so many sequels, and all the sequels, I think, supposedly revolve more around the Cenobites and the torture porn-esque thing.
Yeah. Well, we don't like to talk about a lot of the sequels, to be fair.
It never happened. There's only one.
No, and it's. I tried to sit through most. I actually own quite a few of those, and I've tried to sit through them, and it is kind of painful because a lot of those. I mean, it's completely going off tangent again, but kind of a lot of those sequels weren't actually Hellraiser movies to begin with. They were something else, and then they've kind of this could be a Hellraiser movie if we just put Pinhead in it, and he can just show up at the end and stuff.
That's amazing.
So there is a lot of that, and you can kind of tell the films that weren't designed to be Hellraiser movies from day one. It really shows. But I guess they kind of had this idea, this script or whatever, and had to kind of find a way to get people to see it, even if it was a straight to video piece of shit or whatever. They still kind of needed that hook for some people. No pun intended there. But and making them like Hellraiser sequels, that's kind of enough to kind of draw people into actually, take that off the video shelves, take it home and watch it.
Sometimes that's a good thing to do. I know the fourth Die Hard movie, Live Free or Die Hard, was original. I mean, it's based on a novel and has nothing to do with John McClane, but they were like, hey, what if we we want to make this a movie, but what if we replace this main character with John McClane? And I mean, that's my second favorite Die Hard movie. Of course, the first is the best Christmas movie ever. But
he's definitely one is
it's amazing, and it's wonderful to think that that was not like originally meant to be Die Hard.
Yeah, there's a lot of. The only other one I can think of off the top of my head, there's loads more, but I know that 10 Cloverfield Lane was originally a script called The Cellar or something like that, and then it got picked up by Abrams and all that, and it kind of, they developed it as a Cloverfield film, which
and I think, like, the last 2 minutes or something actually like had to do with the other Cloverfield, which I've never seen.
Yeah, absolutely. That ending did feel a bit tacked on. You can kind of tell where they took over and went, well, let's, but this kind of the last 5 minutes is it's all aliens and shit, So
that was another one of those films. It was marketed as like this hardcore like horror like film, and then I watched it and I'm like, this is a drama. Like,
it's three people sat in a cellar and tension, and it's great. I love that film, but yeah, I wouldn't say it's a straight up horror flick.
Yeah, it's kind of like horror with like a horror thriller, because it definitely has a horror elements of it where like somebody's in danger and it does try to like scare you, but it's definitely not like you said, straight up horror where like
she was only in danger because she wasn't accepting his help.
If only she had just
if only she would have been like, thank you for saving my life, everything would have been fine. He wouldn't have shot the other guy. Spoiler alert.
He wasn't crazy at all, right?
Yeah, he was perfectly sane. Everybody else was crazy.
John Goodman as a crazy guy. That was an amazing combination.
Listen, if I woke up in a cellar and John Goodman was there and was like, I just saved your life, I'd be like, thank you, John Goodman. And thank you for being on Roseanne. You made that show wonderful.
I loved you in Big Lebowski.
Yeah, he was the only good part of that movie.
I love Big Lebowski. You're just a bad person.
It's a fucking terrible movie, man.
That's okay. Torture porn. Okay.
It is torture for me to watch that movie. But anyway.
Yeah, I definitely think that. I think torture porn is a legit term for certain movies, because you'll definitely watch some where it's like, this is just a reel of torture moments. There's no real plot to it, and.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's overused, and it's just like kind of done so that people don't really have to think very much about what they're seeing. It's like, okay, the context of this makes me uncomfortable. So rather than like kind of like going past that and like trying to analyze why, it's like, well, it makes me uncomfortable because it's a bad movie. It's just torture porn. And I find that a lot in things where like there's definitely movies I like Hellraiser is a good example of that, where I've met people who are like, oh, it's just a bunch of gore and stuff like that. I'm like, no, there's a lot more going on with it. And
yeah,
it's, I think it's an excuse to be lazy in a lot of ways and just like to dismiss things that make people feel kind of uncomfortable.
Well, it is one of those subgenres that really do exist, and there are few things that actually fit into it like perfectly. But like there are some gems out there. I mean, it's kind of like nunsploitation. Like, yes, it exists. There are films that are solely made to exploit the fact there are nuns in the film. Torture porn's the same way. It's meant to exploit ultra violence, as ultra violence was meant to be, not as in A Clockwork Orange. Yeah,
and I feel like bringing back to kind of what you mentioned there, you mentioned it as a subgenre, and I feel like obviously that's not how it started out, but in a way, and to some directors and filmmakers' credits, they've kind of embraced it a little bit, and it's now kind of become a subgenre, and really it's not a term used that much anymore or applied to very many films these days. Like, but yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that they took this term that was supposedly, I guess, meant as a derogatory term for the movies and kind of owned it. Really took it back and said, hey, yeah, that's fine, that's what this is. This is
they embraced it.
So hats off to those guys for doing that. But hey, yeah,
definitely. There are also some films that are just bad, and they'll have a lot of torture scenes where you can tell they're trying to make like a slasher film, but they're just not good at writing it. So you're like, wait, why did they do that? And it's like, okay, like I don't think it's so much that this is a torture porn, but so much as it's just kind of shitty writing, and they didn't think of all the reasons why this was going on.
Yeah, I guess that does play into it quite a bit, and I think like budgetary things as well. Like obviously makeup effects can cost a lot of money, but like it if that's where all your money's going, then obviously you haven't got a lot for anything else. So, you know, that again might play into part of the reason why, you know, a lot of those kind of movies are kind of shitty, because they're literally, that's all they're putting their money into. But, you know, I think also a lot of like makeup effects people like use these movies as showcases. Like, they're basically just big showreels for like people that can do this kind of shit. You know, which I guess is kind of cool, but you know, yeah, it's just sort of that could possibly explain why there's so many shitty films out there, like that fall under this kind of the umbrella of torture porn. That just, you know, I mean, I'm not. Yeah, most of them pretty much don't have a story. I will give Saw credit, and I will give. I think like the first Hostel, I didn't actually think was as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. There is somewhat of a story there. There is some things going on, not like amazing things, but you know, a lot more than a lot of the kind of stuff that came out after it that was kind of, you know, made because this was the new thing, this is the new trend in horror. But yeah, there's a hell of a lot of crap out there.
Definitely. One of the other things that I think adds into it, when Paul was saying about some of those, in some movies that just kind of like draw out the death scenes, it's like there are some movies where the death scene should only be like 5 or 10 seconds. Even that's stretching it. But then they put it into slow motion, and it draws out for like a minute or 2 minutes.
They're trying to get to a full-length movie so they can market it as a full-length movie.
So it's like every death scene turns into this slow motion, drawn out, you know, bloodbath, or you know, or like torture-esque scene that really was unnecessary to begin with. Yeah,
I sort of like just mentioning something off the top of my head. I actually read an article a couple of weeks ago now, actually, before you actually approached me to do this episode, and it was, I won't say what website it was on, but it was an article about a film that was made in 2010, so 7 years ago, and it had only been shown at a couple of film festivals, so it literally had like maybe 3 or 4 screenings tops. It's not available to buy or rent or anything like that anywhere on any service or anything like that. And it was, weirdly enough, it was actually made by a filmmaker from Cambridge, which is where I'm from. And it's a film made in 2010 called Pig. And it's a 70-minute film. And it is basically one massive torture porn movie. Literally, it's from beginning to end. Well, I haven't seen it, but like from the article's description, it's essentially a guy and his accomplice kill 3 people. And it's the long, drawn-out torture and what he puts them through. And there is literally, like, no story. There's very little dialogue. It is 70 minutes of a guy just, performing very harsh acts on 3 people. And then it kind of ends. And, I mean, I have no idea how it got funded or how it got made or anything like that. But apparently it's, like, there's no real plans to show it anywhere else again. Just simply because no one will touch this thing. And
have you ever seen the Masters of Horror series?
Yes.
The first season, John Carpenter's Cigarette Burns.
Yes.
The movie that it's like so vile or so captivating, whatever, that it draws it drives its audience insane. So nobody's allowed to see it.
Yeah, the absolute end of the world or something it was called. Yeah. I actually quite liked that. That was a really good episode.
Yeah, I loved that one, but that just reminded me of that. It's like no one is allowed to see Pig because it will drive you mad, or it is so vile, so disgusting.
Yeah, I think it's like one of those films. They screened it originally when it was made, and people literally just, I mean, most of the audience walked out. And so there was just no way, no distributor was going to touch it. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. The censors would have just ripped it apart. So it's kind of been this thing that's like, this weird anomaly that sort of gets dragged around very rarely at festivals, but apparently it's been shown a handful of times. And I don't think the filmmakers are actually planning to show it again, like at least not anytime soon. So, but yeah, it was an interesting read if you can find any information about it, because there's an IMDb and everything for it. It's a legitimate film, but there's very little information out there about this film, because obviously only a handful of people have really seen it. You know, I just found it kind of interesting, and then you guys approached me to do this episode, so I was like, I've got to mention that.
Definitely. We were at horror convention a few weeks ago, and there was a guy we were talking to who made a few films that he actually almost got arrested for because he said they were so realistic that they thought they were smut films and
Snuff.
Yeah, snuff films. And it kind of he said that in order to really get their name out there, they had to be extreme. So I think sometimes in order to because it's really hard to get your movies out there. So I think a lot of times people go for more extreme things because it's like every word about your film is free publicity. So I think that has something to do with it.
Yeah, it may play into that whole thing of like any publicity is good publicity, and I think there's a lot of, I mean, if they're struggling filmmakers and there's a lot of kind of aggression and anger there, like why we're busting around who's making films, it's not easy, it's not cheap, what we got to do to get noticed, and I think a lot of people will resort to that kind of thing, and for the most part I guess it worked, but then you're kind of labelled as that guy or that director that did that thing, and I don't know. It's kind of funny you mentioned about like kind of snuff films. Like I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but there was the Guinea Pig series I think they're from Japan.
Yeah, I've heard of those.
And Charlie Sheen saw one of those at a party and reported it to the police. And as a real this is a real snuff film, obviously they investigated and it's like nah. I mean the particular one he saw, I will admit, like the effects in it for the time it was made and the budget it was made on, like the effects are insane. Even hold up today. Do you know what I mean? So I can kind of see why he sort of may have thought that at the time. But it's just kind of a cool story. Like, and again, like no publicity is bad publicity. So I guess that's kind of sales of those have gone up since that happened. I don't know.
Yeah, when we talked to the guy Paul was talking about at the horror convention, he even asked, he's like, oh, have you guys seen the newest Guinea Pig movie? And I was like, I've never seen any of them. And I mean, I've heard of them. I've definitely noticed them on the internet. I've just never ordered or watched any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I've probably only seen maybe one or two. I think again, most of them are kind of pretty ridiculous, and again, no story really. They're just kind of, again, it was torture porn before torture porn was even a term. Again, so this, like I said, torture porn has existed way beyond. I mean, even though you're saying again with films like I Spit on Your Grave, I mean, the original version of that was, it came out in the 70s. So, and again, going back, I mean, again, it does play into kind of what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable at the time. And again, going back to saying about freaks and stuff like that, at the time that wasn't acceptable. You bring that kind of thing out now, it's like you said, it's an American Horror Story. It's on mainstream, it's on TV. I think another movie, this is kind of going back onto another tangent we were on earlier, but playing into that, I mean, there was another movie called Peeping Tom. I think it's a British film, and it came out in the 60s. And again, it's a film where it was kind of ahead of its time, and it was kind of a stalker slasher kind of film. And the director made the movie, released it, everyone was outraged, and he never worked again. It ruined his career. But you watch that film now, and it's it's good. It's it's totally acceptable. There's nothing wrong with this, But at the time, everyone was just absolutely outraged by it. So, again, it's obviously rolling with the times. What we're desensitized to, kind of builds up, and I guess in as time goes on, it takes more and more and more to shock people, and then you kind of end up with things like a Serbian film.
Yeah, I guess all taboos have to be broken at some point. So there's always somebody to challenge it, and it's not till time goes by that it's either appreciated later on or it's just kind of shrugged off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before horror films, there were actually shows people would go to called I wish I remember what they're called, but they'd have scenes. They were kind of like operas, except they were specifically to show people supposedly getting tortured and murdered. They'd have fake blood and body parts. And,
there's a movie that's kind of like that. I think it's called the Theater Bizarre or something. Was that? Is that
it's
the
probably
term?
Based off things like that. I don't think that was the name.
I think you're talking about Penny Dreadfuls,
that
right?
Was it, yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and people would just go to them because it's wow, look at that. It's because I think we all have some kind of baser instinct, enjoy that to a degree. It's just kind of compartmentalizing that so we can function as normal people, and obviously different people have a different threshold for that. So I think that I think like most people, like, I mean, there's a reason why people watch this kind of stuff, even though it seems very contradictory to just how we function.
Now, just you mentioning that, it sparked a memory of the movie Blood-Sucking Freaks,
I was just thinking that too.
where
yeah.
the alternate title was The Great Torture Show. And that's what that guy put on was, I mean, he had his theater in the middle of, nowhere, where he would torture people on stage, which in the movie it was real, quote unquote. And then people would just be like, oh, this is the worst thing, his effects are terrible, and this is, shitty. And then it's like, well, he was actually murdering people on stage, like...
Fuck.
The way those are a lot of a critique on the audience, because it's like you're watching somebody torture somebody for other people, but you're watching the torture and everything. So it's weird, like kind of commentary and all that.
That's what I gotta say. Yeah, no, I agree.
So I think we may have just about covered torture porn and a few other subjects along the way.
Yeah. Well, before we go, like, are there any films that you guys like that are like just basically torture porn, but you kind of like anyways?
Well, I mean, again, being a fan of horror, I'm not adverse to gore. I feel like you gotta have stuff in balance. So, like, a decent story and a bit of gore, that's and some good acting. Throw all that together if you can do it. It's great. I mean, not to plug things, but we are in the middle of production on a film at the moment, and this one's kind of got. Not to sort of blow too many secrets here, but we've got a fair few little the most makeup effects I think we've done to date, which again isn't a massive amount, but there's stuff in there. We're planning to shoot some fairly grotesque stuff, and I don't know how it's going to plan out, but it could be quite interesting. But no, as far as films and stuff, I've pretty much mentioned quite a few things that I've enjoyed in the past. I'd mentioned like the kind of French extreme new wave stuff there. There's quite a few movies within that I kind of enjoy and I quite like, and I've also feel like for some reason I need to mention some of like Herschel Gordon Lewis's films, because again, like going back to the subject of torture porn, back in the kind of the 60s when like Blood Feast and shit like that was being made, that was like, that was pretty hardcore for the time, kind of amazing that guy literally could more or less make whatever kind of movie he wanted and didn't give a fuck, in that kind of time. It's kind of amazing, really. But no, other than that, my mind's kind of gone a bit blank as far as kind of other films, I guess. I don't know.
I think any film is worth watching once by somebody. I mean, I don't really have any like in particular torture porns that I'll say, oh, I really want to watch this like over and over. Like I have to be in the right mood to watch it. Like, I mean, if I had to pick one, I would say the original Saw is probably my favorite of that kind of stuff, just because it's much more dialogue heavy. And it's a lot more of a conundrum for the players involved as opposed to the other ones and subsequent movies that follow where it's just how gory can we make this kill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, as far as like that goes, there's so many movies I'll be watching where I kind of get the opposite, where they talk too much. I'm like, okay, just fucking kill them already. I want to see like the fucking blood already. But yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there definitely fit like certain horror films where I'm like, okay, I get it. I understand the plot, but just kill them already, for God's sake.
The Green Inferno is one like that.
That was one like that.
Again.
But yeah, I think
before we end, because it's torture porn, I found this story. It's very short, but this is kind of an interesting example of torture porn. I'll just read this real fast. This is the story of a day where there was all this blood. A man was walking around, and blood started coming out of him everywhere. There was so much blood that it filled up an elevator. He went to the store, and there was just blood all over the place. People were slipping in it, and they were all grossed out. He tried to go swimming, and all of the sharks went nuts and bitten everyone. he got chased by all the vampires ever. One time, the blood got a kid and a dog. At the end of the day, everyone decided they would send him to space so that they would stop getting blood everywhere. The scariest part is that man was you. Or if he was a lady, if you are a lady, and you forgot that this happened.
Where did you find that?
It's a creepypasta I found online.
Oh, it's one of those creepypasta things.
It's called
Okay.
To the Day of the Blood.
Oh, okay. I mean,
I found that and I'm like, that's amazing.
It's the sort of thing you find written in shit on the wall of like an asylum or something.
Find it like by a urinal somewhere.
Yeah, what the fuck?
I think that I think that brings us to a conclusion of torture porn. But before we go, Dan, do you want to tell us where we can follow you and find out about any of your projects that you're currently working on?
Yeah, no worries. Twitter is a very good place to find out that information. At Daniel M. Young, all one word. We have a website which is Viral Films. That's VIRAL Films.uk. And yeah, I mean, we've got a Facebook page as well. Just search for Viral Films UK. It's pretty much all there.
Well, it was awesome having you on again.
No, it's been great. Thank you very much for having me back on. It's been amazing.